Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Leming Wang. I'm co-hosting the seminar with Dr. Chris Monsieur. Today we're very pleased to have one of our own to do a seminar on a topic we believe we haven't covered in, say, at least 5 years in our seminar. So we're having Professor Jenny Liu with us. So Jenny is an assistant professor in our urban study and planning program. And she is what's your title? Assistant director for the NERC, Northwest Economic Research Center. Sorry for stumbling on that. And she will be talking about the understanding transportation in urban China, the disparity between the travel behavior of local residents and migrant worker. We believe China hasn't come up in the seminar topic for many years, so this will be a first. Okay, with that, I will just give the floor to Jenny.
Transportation seminar for a couple of years, but it's good to be back. This particular topic that I'm presenting on today is kind of an exploratory study on some of the transportation aspects in a particular survey data set that we were able to obtain. And this particular paper that is written between me and my colleague, Professor Fang, who's sitting in the back of the room over there, and our counterpart in China, Zhang Zhanxing. So this is, it's a really interesting topic because transportation has been explored a lot in China, particularly because of the rapid urbanization. It surpassed 50% of population in urban areas. Half of them in the past couple of years, and also because population is growing at such a fast speed that there's a lot of congestion going on in these cities. And so people want to understand what determines the transportation patterns. How do we understand whether or not there are transportation pattern differences between these two populations that I'll be talking a little bit more about. So our research question was pretty simple. It was to examine and characterize the differences in transportation expenditure between local resident households versus migrant worker households in China. Now, this is particularly interesting because before we weren't able to really take a look and explore this particular topic because migrant households are sort of migrants from other cities or other rural areas that migrate to larger cities, larger urban areas in China in search of better employment opportunities. And these tend to be kind of a floating population that isn't really well tracked and not adequately covered in most census types of data. So this was a great area of interest for me, but in the past, I haven't really been able to delve into Chinese research, particularly because of this lack of good data, especially microdata, that we were able to get our hands on, and this was one particular exception. So for today's seminar, I wanted to walk you guys through kind of what are the motivations and background for why we think there might be differences in how people determine where they live and how they approach their transportation decisions, particularly within the institutional setup or structure in China. That makes it really interesting. And then we'll kind of explore through the data a little bit because a lot of the hypotheses that you might have from intuition from Western studies may not always apply in the Chinese context. We looked through the data and really tried to gain a lot more intuition by just taking a look at a lot of the descriptive statistics between locals versus migrants, also between different cities, to really give us that good foundation to kind of get into more rigorous econometric research. So let's talk about some of the motivations for this particular study. So, well, household expenditures are going to be a large part of any household's disposable income. In most Western countries, transportation expenditure tends to be about 20% of household expenditures. But in China, this, in our particular data set, what we saw was that transportation expenditures was actually much lower than that 20%. It was even lower than 10% on a household basis. So that was kind of interesting to see why this is, whether there's maybe some structures that subsidize these transportation expenditures, or whether or not people were living really close to where they work as well. The other reason why we were really interested in looking at this was because, well, we have concerns about environmental sustainability, and there's a lot of talk about how do we structure policies such that we encourage more sustainable or low carbon or more fuel efficient types of transportation. Especially in China, they've been employing policies to encourage lots of electric vehicle adoption. They've been building tons of roads, as well as adding in transit options. So China has about 20% of the world population, and about, I think, 20% of overall greenhouse gases come from transportation. So in China, about 8% of their energy usage comes from transportation, thus making it much, much more important to really focus in on how do people decide on transportation in China, because they pretty much encompass 1/5 of the world population, and thus they're using lots of energy, emitting lots of greenhouse gases. And then also why we focus in on transportation. Well, you're in the transportation seminar, and you should know this, that transportation is obviously a really key determinant in social and economic mobility. Having access to transportation options, particularly when you're a migrant, when you're someone new to a particular urban area, that really determines whether or not you can move up in terms of your socioeconomic status. It also determines whether or not you have access to the job opportunities that you want to kind of climb up. It is also a major social determinant of health, particularly in the Chinese context. What you can see is that you might have seen lots of different pictures of major cities in China with really serious pollution problems, a lot of smog, a lot of particulate matter floating around in the air. And so being in different types of transportation modes, the exposure to these environmental hazards are going to be different. So that's one thing. And then one most interesting structure that we were most interested in was the fact that in China, they have this Hukou System, which is basically a household registration system where you register where basically it's almost like by birth, you are part of a particular household registration in that particular city or that town or that village. And you're registered there, and this Hukou system really was a big barrier to migration. It was a way to track where people are and kind of to keep people where they are. And we'll go through a lot of some of this Hukou system because I think it's a really essential component in understanding why there are differences and how people view their transportation options. So basically, Hukou determines what public services you're eligible for. It determines basically what types of resources you're allocated. So being in different Hukous in different cities or villages determines, for example, how much of flour you might get, how much rice you might get allocated, particularly in the past more older decades, not so much in more recent times. So let's take a look at this Hukou system. Okay, so let's start from the top. Hukou system is a household registration. So you're divided into urban and rural Hukous, or they sometimes call it agricultural versus non-agricultural. So this determines whether you're in an urban area or you're in a non-urban area. And then we're also looking at whether households are local resident households versus migrant worker households. And how we determine that is whether or not you're residing and working in a city or a location where your Hukou is registered. So are you registered in the city where you're working, basically? So for all the migrant worker households that are in our data set, they're basically working, say, in Shanghai, but where their household registration is elsewhere in another city or another village. And some of them, a small portion of them may also have an urban registration, but that allows them to receive some services, but because they're not located in the urban area where they're registered, it also prevents them from receiving most of the larger city resource allocations, basically. Okay, so the system, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was introduced in the 50s, and really as a way to keep a check on the population where everyone is located, and really as a way to allocate all these resources, such as jobs, housing, and all of those staple food supplies and other types of supplies. And there, according to most of the scholars that have looked at this particular system, there are pros and there are cons, although most people think there are probably more cons than there are pros. So in terms of pros, some people have said that this type of system, because it prevented people from mass migrating from places where there's drought or when there was social instability, from migrating all at the same time to urban areas and deserting their villages, thus really limiting agricultural production in those types of times. So they said that this really was a mechanism to ensure more social stability during these types of crises. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that the structure of this particular kind of system really caused structural social inequities. Basically, because you are labeled either urban or rural, or you're restricted to certain geographic locations, structurally, you just don't have access to change and mobility in terms of geographic and also economic mobility. Well, because there was a lot of criticism and the fact that a lot of people, despite this limitation of people being able to migrate from their rural villages to larger cities with more employment opportunities, there was a lot of these floating populations that were migrating. So thus, a lot of reforms started happening to try to maybe make the system a little bit more flexible and make the government be able to account for these people that were kind of in the cities but not registered there. So in the 80s, there were some reforms that were starting, and they introduced these temporary residence certificates, which was a way of, say, legalizing, allowing for people who are migrants to legally be in these urban areas to work. But that's all it did. It was legal for them to be there, but they still did not have the urban registration eligibility. So they still couldn't receive any of the benefits that came with being registered as an urban Hukou person. So because of all this, their transportation and residential locations are really severely limited. So let's take a look at that. So in terms of employment location, which is one of the major determinants of what your transportation costs and behavior patterns are going to be, was really limited because migrants, they were not eligible for government-subsidized affordable housing. So these were cheaper housing that were either built or contracted by the government, and they were sold or rented out at a cheap price to people who had urban hukou. And so these migrants that came to the city, they're not eligible for that. And if, as the housing system was being reformed and the market kind of opened up to private transactions, so not everything was government-owned and government-run, these migrant households did not have access to a credit market, because banks that were giving mortgages for you to buy a house, they required you to have the urban hukou, the eligibility to officially live in that city in order for them to provide you with a bank mortgage. And so that limited a lot of people from actually purchasing a home. They were also sometimes not eligible for secondary housing markets, meaning that when people bought their houses in the beginning, or they were provided allocated housing by the government, and later as the housing market kind of opened up, they weren't allowed to sell some of their housing to these migrant households as well. And also, economically speaking, these villages in the city, in Chinese, Chenzhongchun, these places are going to be the cheaper places to live. They have lower rent, also associated with probably lower quality in the housing, very dense settlements. So migrants tend to be kind of clustered in these locations, more or less. So they were severely limited in terms of where they can live. And also, they were quite limited, on the other hand, by where they can work. So this is becoming less and less of a problem, but in the past, state and collective sectors, so basically things that were run by the state, by the government, these sectors were not allowed to hire migrant workers that were not officially registered in the urban areas where they're located. Just for example, in Beijing in 2009, these state and collective sector jobs accounted for more than 35% of all of the jobs that were there. Well, Beijing probably has a higher percentage than other cities, but this still represented a pretty significant part of the economic sector. They were not eligible for state-owned enterprise jobs, so these were kind of the state/private enterprises that were run, so they couldn't hire those people. And then if you had commercial entities, so things like finance or insurance sectors that were kind of connected to the state or the local government, or if there were hotels that were run, even reception jobs, all of these you were not eligible for if you were under this migrant status. So, your job opportunities are limited, your residential opportunities are limited. So being that both of these things are limiting to migrant households, and makes us really interested in looking at, well, are migrant households now living in these villages in the city that are further away from work, or are they living in dorms that are provided by these large manufacturing firms, or do they have higher or lower transportation expenditures? Are they kind of utilizing different modes of transportation than their local counterparts? So following all of this, in 2014, I think, they actually removed this urban-rural designation in most places and started allowing for large cities, or cities, urban areas in general, to have authority over who can migrate and thus convert their Hukou status to their particular city. But this kind of authority really lies in the hands of these various cities. So the larger the cities were, the more strict they were in terms of who can come and become one of their local residents. And oftentimes this comes with restrictions on what types of jobs you have, how permanent it is, whether or not you have a house or a condo or apartment in that city. So it comes with a whole list of restrictions, which meant that a lot of these migrants that we were really interested in and really want to see how their transportation patterns are structured, they were not going to be the ones that were more or less eligible for these types of conversions. And the larger the city is, the stricter it is, so more migrants still remain. So, okay, so now we're coming down to our data. So our data comes from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Institute of Population and Labor Economics, and it was done in 2009, and it was called the Employment and Social Protection Survey. So this survey was not a transportation-focused survey. It was a survey that really wanted to explore what is the employment situation amongst labor, local workers versus migrant workers, and also to explore their participation in Social Security, how much they've contributed, how long they've contributed, and what industries they were working in general. So it wasn't structured for the purpose that I'm using it for, but it was one of the only data sets that I could get access to that really separated between local and migrant households. Okay, so it was, so this particular survey is pretty long and pretty extensive, so lots of really interesting things that you can study from it, and my colleague, Professor Fang, has studied kind of housing tenure in terms of migrants. So that is another interesting area that you can look at. So this data set, used stratified random sampling. So basically, they looked at 6 different cities, which I'll show you in a second, and so they chose, they randomly selected 街道, which are neighborhoods or sub-districts within these cities, and then randomly selected neighborhoods within these sub-districts, and then randomly selected households within each of these neighborhoods. So overall, they were able to they were able to survey about 700 resident households and about 600 migrant households in each of these cities. And that's a pretty good sample size for this kind of really, really comprehensive data. And so let's take a look at where the data comes from. So on the right here, you can see a map of kind of the eastern side of China. And you can see that the cities that were surveyed in this particular data set kind of was spread all around the place. A couple of coastal cities, some were interior cities, some from the north, some from the middle, some from the south. So a good variety of different places that we were looking at. And in terms of resident versus migrant population, this is data from 2010, you can see that the population really varies amongst these cities. So you have Fuzhou on the bottom here, which has around 2.8 million people, which is still considered a large city, all the way up to Shanghai, up on the top, about 22 million people. And there's a good variety of population, but also the amount of migrants, or the percentage of migrants that were living in these cities, is also quite different. So you have places that had smaller migrant populations, places like Xi'an and Fuzhou, and then you had places that had larger migrant populations as well. So on average, about 45% are considered migrants, and that's pretty significant. You have half of your city who are migrant households or migrant people, and half of your city are not eligible for lots of public services, things like education, things like healthcare, things like subsidized housing. So this is quite a significant problem. So if we delve a little bit deeper into the characteristics of each of these cities, you can see that the density in each of these cities is quite varied. So Fuzhou and Shenyang are the ones that are less dense, and then you have really dense cities. And also their economic status is quite different. You have cities that are much wealthier, like Shanghai, that have large migrant populations, and then you have cities that are like Xi'an that have relatively lower city GDP per capita. So a good variety. Okay, so let's take a look at what are the differences between local and migrant households. So on here, there are some things. So looking at all of the local versus migrant households, there are some surprising things in that sometimes the local and migrant households are relatively similar. For example, most of them have male household heads. They have, let's see, what's interesting here is that migrant households tend to be much, much younger than local households. Migrant household head is around 36 years of age, while the local households are 53 years of age. There's a good percentage of people the majority of them are married, but for migrant households, a lower percentage are living with their spouses, which means that, well, if you looked at the household size, the local households are about 2.9 people, while the migrant households are much smaller at 2.2 persons, which means that these are probably going to be households that, well, with 2 people, probably do not include children in most cases. So these are going to be workers that are living in the cities without other family members along with them. And then in terms of socioeconomics, it's kind of surprising to see that even though local households are older and have larger household sizes, the household incomes are actually not that much different between the local and migrant households. If you looked at the middle part of this graph here, their household incomes are within less than 10% difference if you averaged it out. Obviously, there's a little bit of variation across the different cities, but they're pretty close in terms of income. And the education is also pretty close, and we're looking at something like 10.5 to 11 years of education for the household head. So all of these households are earning relatively similar amounts of money, and they have relatively similar amounts of education. But if you looked at home ownership over there, you can see what's reflected from the Hukou policy, that local households own 80% of their houses, and migrant households, only barely 10% of them have access to home ownership. So all of these are going to contribute to whether or not they're going to be spending more or less on transportation. So just a quick summary of what I just said is that they're younger. The migrant households are younger, have smaller household sizes. They tend to not live with their spouses and not own their own homes. And then let's take a look at the data to see what are some institutional factors that might contribute to their differences in their transportation behavior. So with local households, they tend to have very high urban Hukou-ship, I guess. So the majority of them, like 95 to 99% in each city, have urban household registration, whereas for migrant households, you see like 20-something%. So very big differences there. It's also interesting that party membership, and by party membership, we're talking about the Communist Party, and party membership is much, much higher in local households than migrant households, and you can maybe think about this as a proxy for the amount of political resources you might have access to, a network of people who are well-connected. And then looking at the years in the city, local households tend to be pretty much born and raised or spent most of their lives in the city at about 45 years in the city. But what was also a little bit surprising to me was that migrant households were also not entirely newcomers to the city. On average, they've already been in the city for 7.8 years, meaning that they've pretty much established a household and settled down in the city, except they're still considered migrants, so almost like outsiders in the place where you live and work. Okay, so all of those factors kind of tend to suggest that migrant households have a lack of access to employment and residential opportunities, and also have less connections that might contribute to maybe higher transportation expenditures. But there are other things that we saw that we thought might be things that maybe are kind of counteracting that effect. Particularly when we looked at the migrant households, what we saw was that they had pretty strong social networks or connections with the people that they're living with. The survey included questions about whether or not they were moving to the city with a job, and you can see that not a majority of them have. Only about 30-something% of migrant households actually moved to the city with a job in hand, so most of them came without a job and they were looking for jobs in the city. But a majority of them moved into the city with relatives in the same city, or with laoxiang in the city, which laoxiang means that there are people that are coming from the same original location, so in the same village, the same city, the same town, and these are not necessarily people that you already know beforehand. They may or may not be. So the majority of migrant households came into the city, although without a job, but they had these social network connections that allowed them possibly to maybe have some kind of a safety net in terms of their employment or household situations, and also maybe with transportation options going into the future. So this was kind of an interesting factor to take a look at. So now we come down to the transportation variables here. So this particular data set surveyed whether households owned various different types of private transportation, including automobiles, motorbikes, and bikes. And the way that this is scaled, you can see that the maximum is 14%. This meant that not a lot of households actually owned their own private vehicles, be it a bike or a car. But what you can see across the board here is that local households tend to own a vehicle much more than migrant households. They owned almost 9.5% of them, they own cars, compared to only about 6% for migrants. They also own more bikes than migrant households. So these are factors that we think are going to contribute to their transportation patterns. So when we took a look at their transportation expenditures and kind of looked at the distribution and between the migrant versus the local households, the local is the more red piece and the migrants are going to be the blue piece here, you can see that it's generally pretty distributed pretty much similarly, except that local households had slightly higher overall transportation expenditures on a household basis every month. than their migrant counterparts. So when we were kind of structuring the models to try to predict or say something about what are the main determinants of transportation expenditure, someone suggested to me that maybe we can do propensity score matching or some kind of quasi-experimental design. But when we looked at the data, the two types of households were just so different in terms of their characteristics that it was probably not going to be a good idea to match up local households to migrant households to see what the differences were. So let's look at kind of the spread or the variety of transportation expenditures across different cities. You can see that there is a big variety. In some cities, local households and migrant households had closer transportation expenditures than others. There are several different factors that might contribute to this, one being the types of employment that is available or is more dominant in the particular cities that we're looking at. Other things might include different housing market conditions, as well as the availability of different types of transportation options. So basically, transportation infrastructure is going to be different, as well as kind of how spread out a lot of these cities are. So following all of this exploration, we ran several regression models, and I'm going to show you one of them. And so when we did our analysis, we separated the migrants and the locals into separate models because what we found was that structurally, what determined their transportation expenditures was structurally different. So these are two of the models, one local and one migrant household, and there are also fixed effect coefficients that are not listed on here. So we had city-level fixed effects and also employment categories, but because they're too long, I kind of cut them off, but you can find them in our paper. So basically what we found was that household income and car ownership, not surprisingly, are the biggest determinants of transportation expenditures, being that if you earn more money, you obviously spend more on transportation, even after controlling for how much you spend on other things. Car ownership was a big positive contributor to transportation expenditures for both types of households, meaning that if you owned a car, you were more likely to spend more on transportation expenditures. Obviously, cars are much more expensive to operate than others. But one of the surprising things that we found on here was that for the migrant side, if you looked at some of the Laoshang in city, so having people who are from the same place that you're from in the city, that was a major contributor to lowering your household transportation expenditures, meaning that having these social networks meant that maybe perhaps you're carpooling, maybe you're pooling your transportation resources, but it also possibly meant that there is an existence of migrant enclaves in a lot of these places where migrants are not necessarily working in large manufacturing firms, but a lot of them may be self-employed or entrepreneurs that are operating in their local community as well. And Hukou status was not surprisingly only significant for migrant households, being that urban Hukou is the majority of the local households. I mean, 99 or 95%, depending on which city you're looking at. So having urban Hukou status was not a major determinant for the local households. So with all of that, a little bit of conclusion is that there are differential transportation expenditure patterns, which leads us to believe that their overall behavior or decision factors are going to be rather different, and that different household types have different determinants. And then this may all stem from the fact that they have differential access to employment, to residential locations, as well as other types of public services that are related to all of these things. And that if we were to want to target these different populations to either promote more low-carbon or energy-efficient transportation options, or other types of strategies to, say, promote electric vehicles, that we need to pay attention to the fact that these two populations are going to be rather different. So we plan to explore this data set a little bit more and that is it for my presentation. There's a link on here. You can take a look at our draft paper, which is draft. So we welcome any comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Please say your name before you ask your
Michael Williams. I was struck by how close the income levels were between the two groups, but rates of home ownership, rates of car ownership, and other indicators that usually go along with wealthier groups were so different. And I'm wondering if it's because with the Hukou system, healthcare, education, essentially they're getting services that enable them to have more disposable income because they're getting these services taken care of. Is that, did you look at that? Is that an impact, or?
We didn't specifically look at that, but that's definitely one of the interpretations that we might have why local households tend to have much higher ownership of cars and houses. But I think the major contributing factor to all of this is the fact that they're not allowed to buy a lot of the houses, the migrants, and don't have access to a lot of things in general. So I think that might be the most important factor, but what you're saying is also going to be a contributing factor as well. Yes.
Michael Flynn, Civil Engineering. You said that most people who have studied the Hukou system see that there's more bad than good as a result of it. So why does the system persist? Who is in favor of keeping the system?
Well, in China, the government was in favor of keeping the system, but as I was saying, was that it was very strictly in place for a certain period of time from 1958 to kind of the late 80s, at which time the Chinese economy grew and started privatizing a lot of things and really opening up the market. And at that point was when a lot of the reforms started happening. And it was kind of done on a more experimental basis for many years. Different cities employed different strategies to kind of loosen up and make things more flexible for different groups of people. But it didn't really get kind of a more overarching structural reform until probably the past couple of years, and in 2014 they removed that urban versus non-urban designation. But there are still lots of remaining differences between how different cities dealt with how they wanted to provide services to these different groups of the population. So there's definitely reform going on. It's just not at a super fast pace. Yeah.
Mary Windsor, Civil Engineering. In factories where there's dormitories available for the Arab workers, do you know if those dormitories are strictly limited to either migrants or locals, and who, is it really dependent on who runs the factory, whether it's state-owned or?
Yeah, it does depend, and there's, I think, in the way that the survey is structured, there is a little bit of bias towards more established households instead of serving dormitory types of settings. So it may be that this data set misses some of that, but you're right, it does depend. So what types of people the dormitories house, and whether it's restricted to migrants versus non-migrants, that's kind of up to the individual manufacturers. And that does impact a lot of the transportation, because if you house people right next to the factories, they can just get out of their bed and walk to work. And that really, these types of residential settings remind me of kind of the start of the industrial era, when people were, urban areas were structured around factories with workers living right next to them. So, yeah. Back.
Are migrant workers that are established, are they actively trying to change their Hukou status, or is it kind of something that they're just content with and are just kind of established?
I'm not from China, so I don't have any anecdotal information about this, but from what I understand is that the conversion to having urban Hukou after the most recent reforms have happened is rather arduous and requires a lot of documentation, and only almost the wealthiest, or, well, maybe not the wealthiest, because the wealthiest probably don't really need these public services anyway, but kind of towards the higher end of the spectrum is going to be the people that are going to be eligible anyway. I don't know if Professor Fong has additional insight into whether people are scrambling to convert or not.
Yeah, it is true that if we try to qualify for the yeah, if you are not qualified for the minimum, you should not be qualified.
Yeah, and the restrictions vary across the board. Like, I think Dr. Fang told me that in Guangzhou, they also favor younger households than not. So there's some age discrimination going on in terms of who can convert. They like to have younger households move in that are going to stay there for longer. I'm not sure exactly. So there's a big range of what they can require. Yeah.
Yeah, I can give some information about this conversion from the Hukou system. And from the beginning of the Hukou system built, I'm business scholar from Shanghai. And from the beginning of the Hukou system built, there are, as I knew, there are 5 to 6 paths to this conversion from the rural area Hukou to urban Hukou. So there are 6 paths, and maybe there are more paths during these 5 to 10 years. And but I also have a small question that I'm care about the sample from the survey of CASS and the worker. How did they define the worker? For example, my hometown is in rural area, but I'm a citizen of Shanghai. But actually, I don't know whether I belong to local resident or to migrant, because I got the Shanghai urban Hukou just from the time I graduated from the university. So maybe, but I don't know the definition of this sample. Maybe the workers refer, it means the manual jobs, manual labors of immigrants, or I don't know. For example, a lot of students graduate from the university, they're working in Shanghai, but some of them can get the urban Hukou just from the day they stay in Shanghai, but some others may take a longer time, maybe 5 to 10 years to get the urban Hukou. But how about this sum?
I think from what I remember is that they divided local versus migrants depending on where their Hukou is registered, whether they're living in the city or the town where their Hukou is registered. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think there are 3 ways of you can convert your Hukou to a different place. So after graduation from college, you can do that. And the second is you can only move to the city unless you get a Hukou from the cities, from your employer. So your employer will support your Hukou. And the third one is you join the army, and after you retire from the military, you can gain Hukou but back in your hometown, like maybe the town closest to your village. I think one thing, the one argument of the Hukou's benefit is China didn't experience the kind of slums in many developing countries. So that is the people who argue the validity of this Hukou system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Samuel Rudisky. So if you have migrants living outside of their Hukou and they have children, are those children assigned to the Hukou of the parents, or are they assigned to the Hukou where they're born?
I believe that they're assigned to their birth parents. So it's not where you are born. So basically, they inherit the non-urban or the non-local status of their family. Basically, it gets passed on. Yeah.
Jeremy Dalton, not I I'm curious about the kinds of trips, the types of trips. And so when you say, all right, whole travel and trip expenditures, is that just local transportation, getting to and from work? We're talking about people commuting, or does this include trips out of town, which of course is going to be substantially higher for the population, for the migrant populations who are regularly, routinely, at least once a year, going back home for most of them?
I believe that this includes all of their transportation expenditure. So the survey has pretty detailed questions about all of their spending in various different categories, like in housing and food and transportation and other things. So I would believe that included kind of an averaged out amount of how much they spend on transportation, both commuting and recreational, and to go back home if they were to do so.
I have another question is in one of your slides, the 7 cities or 6 cities? Six, yeah. But why there are 2 cities of Xi'an and Wuhan, the transportation expenditure of local residents and migrants are very big difference compared with other cities? Why?
Well, I don't know specifically in those cities why, but we were thinking that it has to do with the fact that different cities have different industries that are more dominant in those places. So the industry makeup, whether those industries provide dormitory housing or they provide subsidized transportation or housing close to where whatever industry it is, that's going to affect it. And also, what the privatized housing market looks like in those cities is also kind of another reason or factor that can really determine how different the migrant versus the locals are. And also, I guess, prevalence or existence of these villages in the city, whether or not there are lots of them or not, that also can determine whether people can get into more centralized locations and spend less on transportation for the migrant households. So we'd have to take a closer look at these cities in order to kind of figure that out. Thanks.
Can you go back to the regression results? I find it's pretty interesting that the presence of children is negative for local residents, but is positive for migrants. Might be kind of the things, the public surveys, availability for school and something there.
Quite possibly. Yes, as you mentioned, the access to different schools or public schools or educational options are different for migrants versus locals. And also there's a difference in terms of how many of the migrant households have children in the data set. So for the migrant households, there's a much lower amount of households that do have children, whereas the local households, there's a greater variety, kind of a more normal distribution of whether or not they have children. And yes, if they had children, maybe it means that they're not traveling as far from their homes. Although neither of those are significant. But it does give us an idea of the sign. Yeah.
Another question on how the incomes are so. I'm wondering what about the distribution of wages in these cities, if it might be compressed, and so that difference is larger than it might seem otherwise.
And maybe actually didn't take a look at the distribution of wages for the 2 different populations, but what we know is that the kind of distribution of employment in various industries is quite different between the local households versus the resident households. So that would be an interesting to take a look at, definitely. Yeah.
Do migrant workers have a limit on how far they can kind of advance in their specific field? As far as can they get some management?
Well, it depends on specifically what industry they are working in, and it's a kind of interesting thing to look at, particularly because migrant workers are not allowed to work in a lot of the state-owned industries or anything that's related to government functions or anything government subcontracts out. So in those cases, if they did work in those places, it's probably going to be under the table illegal, which means that their chances of getting advanced are going to be limited. But on the other hand, if they were in private sector, so private enterprises, or they're self-employed, or they're entrepreneurs starting out their own small business, then there's going to be less of that effect going on. So I don't think this data set actually captures that particular effect.
Second question, it seems like the data sort of obscures the tremendous variety in the migrant population. You know, where in any of these cities, we're not talking about just people that have gone or working in these factories. People, you know, it's like these are people. There's a lot of people that are totally illegal, that are just there and doing some kind of work and have some sort of business, right? And then there's also a lot of other people that are there working legally with some sort of, you know, as a registered employee, but don't have their local Hukou. So I guess I'm curious how that, I don't know, how you see that playing out in the data, because it's a really, really big, diverse population, and it's big.
Yeah. So in this data set, because it does survey whether or not you're contributing to Social Security payments. And so that piece can give us some clues as to whether or not they're working at kind of more stable or contract-based legal jobs per se. But you're right, it does obscure some of those truly illegal migrants who are kind of living at the bottom of the income levels. And that's kind of a feature of all of the census, all of the microdata that's available, is that migrants tend to be undersurveyed in most cases, particularly the lower spectrum of them.
Exactly, and I think a lot of the questions that we get out about why and what the real difference is we're kind of tend to be asking about that population in some ways, and that population largely might not even be in the data.
I mean, they may or may not be, but I'm hoping that this is a data set that gives us a window of insight into some of it and gives us a good start to try to think about what are those problems and what are the solutions to solving those problems. So, yeah. Are there online questions?
Any questions? If there is no question, I do have one online question here. What's the availability and cost of public transportation in the survey city? And I suppose that varies quite a bit. And do you have any information of how that will impact the cost for transportation?
Well, that definitely is a factor that influences whether you have high transportation costs versus low transportation costs, and because that varies across cities, and that's something that we don't have kind of on a micro level, on a household by household basis. That's why we included the fixed effect as the citywide fixed effects to capture that those characteristics that vary across cities, but we do not include as individual variables here. But there is definitely data on the amount of, I think, the length of transit lines, the length of roadways, and other infrastructure transportation types of data that's available on a city-by-city basis. One thing that I've been thinking of is that this microdata actually includes everyone's addresses, so that might be an interesting way to kind of geocode and try to explore where they're located in relationship to what transportation options are available to the specific households. But I haven't looked through to see whether or not these addresses are accurate enough for us to actually do this kind of study. So that's something that we've been thinking about. Yeah.
I don't know if you had enough data, but did you look at migrant households that hadn't been in the city for so long and see if there was any big differences between?
You mean breaking it out, kind of stratifying it by how long they've been in the city?
Yeah.
We actually haven't done that, but that's an interesting factor to look at, kind of dividing them up into kind of the more recent migrants versus the more established ones. That would be a good way
For 7
to.
years in the city, I wouldn't consider myself a migrant anymore. I'd say I'm
Right.
not there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And would you be able to kind of partition out the cost across different transportation modes?
Unfortunately, because it's not a transportation survey, they don't. There's not that data available, unfortunately. Because it would have been great to see what amount do they spend on commuting, what amount do they spend on other purposes, and also for commuting, whether they're spending it on car or are they spending it on transit or other types of modes. But unfortunately, it's not available. So we're making do with the best that we can do with the available data that tells us some interesting results and outcomes and allows us to pursue this research further going forward.
Any more final questions?
I think there's one up here.
Yeah, and we want to make some extended research or extended findings, make the implications research for other areas related to other areas.
Well, this is definitely an area of research that I plan to do more with and also to explore the survey more. But are you talking about other geographic areas?
Yeah, I think because it's a very interesting topic here. Yeah, and but I can give you an example. Ma Yun, do you know Ma Yun?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. Half of his time is staying in Shanghai, but he's a migrant.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to the definition of migrant, he's a migrant to Shanghai.
Okay.
He's not a local resident here.
Right.
But Marino, he has a very, very big empire of industry. So if you can extend the research and the details for the sort of the education and his own practical properties and transportation expenditure, I think you can get more interesting results.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot more to explore and to think about the policy implications, especially as this is one of my first explorations of Chinese data and Chinese research. There's a lot of kind of hidden implications or hidden policy rules that I might not be familiar with, so lots more to learn and lots more to find out from this particular data set going forward. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's thank Professor Jen and